When people think of the LGBTQ community, most people are familiar with what it means. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer, as well as many other labels that people identify as. But the term non-binary may seem foreign to some people. At Urban Plains, we would argue that non-binary is still under construction. People outside of the LGBTQ community aren't really aware of what it means, and it's becoming much more prevalent nowadays. Our goal today is to explain the identity of non-binary and raise awareness about a lesser-known part of the LGBTQ community. And while some are unaware of this identity, many people argue that this isn't a new idea.
One thing that I hear a lot is like, oh, non-binary, like this is some newfangled idea. I've never heard of it before, and it's just amazing to me. And one thing we always make sure to cover is that like non-binary people have existed for like thousands of years.
There has a long history of individuals who don't fit neatly into a gender binary that I think has often been erased from history because we want to have a neat little history and avoid complexity. And of course, a lot of people who did not have the good fortune of being born into a culture that was accepting of non-binary genders had to hide that.
And how can we support those folks? Because they exist. There's conclusive evidence. We're right here in front of you right now, in fact. So we do exist, and we do have slightly different needs from time to time than the average straight cis person.
Say that if you're looking at individuals who identified as different than male or female, you can go back even before the establishment of this country and look at indigenous peoples of North America, and before colonization, before decimation from Europeans, that many indigenous nations recognized individuals who did not identify as male or female.
So we need to know what biological sex is. We need to know what gender is. We need to know what the term binary means in this context. And in this case, we're basically talking about men and women, right? And so non-binary would fall somewhere outside of those two categories. Now, people get uncomfortable with that because they assume that those are the only two categories, which is not the case.
People who identify as non-binary are individuals who don't see themselves as male or female, that gender is diverse, that it's not an either or, just as race is not an either or.
My relationship with it is that it's really interesting. The more I try to identify, because I identify pretty closely with being like trans masculine non-binary. For the longest time I was like, maybe I'm just like a trans man, maybe I'm just actually like cis and I don't realize, I just got really confused by like what gender could mean. And the cool thing about being non-binary is that it's just a really nice kind of expansive way to talk about gender.
There's no one way to be non-binary. I would categorize myself as an agender person because that's how I conceive of it. I understand that gender is important to a lot of other folks. It's not terribly important to me, and the more people make it important about me, the more uncomfortable I feel.
I identify as genderqueer. That's a relatively new term. I came out in the early 2000s and said that I was assigned male, but I don't identify that way, but I don't identify as being female either. Other trans people did not know what to do with me because they came from a mindset that if you're trans, that you're binary trans, that you will transition, that you'll become a trans man, trans woman. There wasn't the cultural space at that time for individuals who were outside of that paradigm, if it was transgender equals transsexual.
Max and Keenan work for One Iowa here in Des Moines. One Iowa is a nonprofit organization that works to advance, empower, and improve the lives of LGBTQ Iowans. They do everything from workplace trainings to fighting for and promoting the civil rights and safety of the LGBTQ community?
So what we do in our trainings is we really start with a foundation, and regardless of who's in the room and what their knowledge level might be, we start really, really basic. So we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sex. What is sex? Like, it's a biological classification. Let's start there. Like, how do we talk about that? We do that, and then we slowly build up. So we define terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, things like that. But what we really try to break down is the idea that like gender identity, sex, and gender expression are all like lined up in a line. We really try to like divorce those concepts so that people understand that sex and gender are not the same thing, and gender expression doesn't indicate gender.
What it means to be in a category that isn't one of the two categories that those folks are familiar with. And that can be, it's tough for folks to wrap their heads around, right? So even though I have a specific way that I'm non-binary, I think the more important thing for folks to understand is that gender is a social construction. That doesn't mean that it's meaningless or valueless. Money is also a social construction. It is very real.
And really to like zoom out about their preconceptions about gender and recognize that there's so much about gender we can't know for other people, and that we want to avoid making assumptions about other people based on how they look or talk or act, as kind of a foundation for working with the LGBTQ community.
Our goal is literally just equality and recognizing what equality is, right? Like if you go to the eye doctor and the eye doctor is giving everybody the same eyeglasses prescription, like, yeah, that's equal, but not terribly helpful, right? Like different people have different needs. And so even though our goal is equality, the mechanisms that we use to get there may look different. They may look like we're doing something different for trans folks than we are for cis folks, but that's because we're trying to address their needs in the same way that cis folks have their needs addressed.
The 5 things that I recommend people really focus on is mirroring language. So listening to the way that people talk about themselves and mirroring that language back to them can really help you be more LGBTQ inclusive in ways that you might not think about. So instead of referring to someone as like a queer woman when she is self-identified as a lesbian, listen to the fact that she says like, I am a lesbian, and mirror that language back to her, right? So that's an example of a time when you can be affirming when you might not think about it, right? Also avoid making assumptions. That's like maybe the thing I try to drive home the most, because so often folks that are not in the community like take a look at another person, do some quick mental math on what they think their gender is, and misgender them or refer to them in a way that's not like affirming. And I think even members of the LGBTQ community do that. I think that happens to everyone because our brains are kind of determined to categorize, but trying to move out of that place where we're making assumptions about other people's gender or sexual orientation or anything like that. And then the last 3 things that I try to focus with people on is asking and using pronouns. So not just knowing like that they, them, and theirs, or z, zers pronouns exist, but how to use them and also how to ask for them, because we should normalize asking about pronouns. And then using gender neutral and gender inclusive language. Finally, and the thing I haven't touched on as much yet today is the art of the apology. Like, I think it's pretty irresponsible to teach folks like about the LGBTQ community and not explain to them how to, like, when they mess up, because they're going to, how to come back from that and how to like talk about that and apologize in a way that's actually like affirming to that person and doesn't place the burden on them to make you feel better.
Gender identity and understanding what that means is an evolving topic. It's still under construction. And while our journey today to define non-binary has been a bit ironic, we at Urban Plains hope it's the first of many steps towards equality and acceptance.